What if Disney had an overall plan for the Star Wars sequel trilogy? I think the main point that people get is that there's not really a lot of connective tissue between episodes 7, 8, and 9. So let's just say hypothetically that I was part of the Lucasfilm story team and I had an opportunity to present Kathleen Kennedy and Bob Iger with my story ideas. So with all that being said, let's get into my alternate ideas of how The Force Awakens could have played out. So we start off with Supreme Leader Kylo Ren landing on the planet of Exegol. And in my version, Kylo Ren is already Supreme Leader of the First Order. He slowly enters one of the caverns and hears a faint voice all around him. He then realizes that the voice is Emperor Palpatine. Kylo Ren's confused and wants to know what's going on, and Emperor Palpatine says, "There has been an awakening. Have you felt it? The dark side and the light." He convinces Kylo Ren to find old Sith relics to restore his body. And this will be a good setup for episodes 7 and 8, leading up to Resurrection episode 9. So Kylo Ren obeys and heads back to his First Order ship. He meets up with Captain Phasma and informs him on a mission to find Luke Skywalker because he's the holder of Darth Vader's burnt helmet. So Captain Phasma grabs a group of troopers and heads down the planet of Tatooine to encounter Luke. And this is when we're introduced to the trooper FN-2887, later known as Finn. He nervously puts on his trooper helmet, raises his weapon, and enters the transport ship. And as they're heading down to the planet, there can be some banter between him and the troopers saying like, "Hey man, this is going to be a really good mission," and Finn being like, "Oh, I don't really know about this." The troopers eventually land on Tatooine, the doors open, and they engage in a fight with the villagers. Luke hears commotion coming from outside of his hut and exits. He sees all the chaos happening around him and ignites his lightsaber. Kylo Ren sees this and ignites his own lightsaber. They engage in a brief lightsaber duel, and Kylo Ren ends up getting the upper hand. He force pushes Luke Skywalker and he flies back into the wreckage. Luke accidentally drops the lightsaber and Finn nervously walks up to it. Finn picks up the lightsaber and examines it and suddenly feels the Force. In this version, we start planting seeds early of Finn's Force sensitivity. Kylo Ren approaches him and tells him to bring the lightsaber back to his chambers. Kylo then orders the troopers to search the grounds for the helmet. They search for a little bit and eventually find the burnt helmet. They hand it back to Kylo, head back to the transport, and go back to their First Order ship. Meanwhile, back at the village, Luke's hand pops up from the wreckage and he pulls himself up. He sees all the chaos and destruction around him and crouches down next to R2-D2 and places a hand gently on him. Meanwhile, back on the transport, Finn removes his helmet in anguish and looks around at all the chaos that he's done. He then transitions back to Tatooine and meet the scavenger Rey. And in this version, Rey actually wants to get off the planet and wants to have a life of adventure. And these same beats can play out as the original Force Awakens. She looks around the downed Star Destroyer for random scraps. She gathers them and takes them back to her village. She cleans them off as she looks in the distance as ships flying by. And in this version, BB-8's actually made a droid that belongs to her that she found in a junkyard a while back ago. So she hands Ankar Plutt the scraps, and he gives her insufficient portions. Basically, her life is miserable. Meanwhile, back in the Star Destroyer, Finn wants to escape the First Order, so he sneaks into a TIE fighter. Troopers spot him and begin to blast at him. Finn fights back and blasts his way out of the Star Destroyer hangar. The TIE fighters pursue him and he attempts to outmaneuver them. Finn's ship is eventually blasted and he crash lands back on Tatooine. Meanwhile, back in the Destroyer, Kylo and Phasma discuss the urgency of getting the lightsaber back. Phasma tells him that she saw Finn holding the lightsaber as he escaped. Kylo then demands her to send a team of troopers down back to the planet to retrieve the lightsaber. Meanwhile, back on the planet, Rey and BB-8 exit the downed Star Destroyer and see the TIE fighter in the distance. Rey puts BB in a pouch, mounts her speeder, and speeds off to the crashed TIE fighter. Meanwhile, Finn exits the wreckage and walks around the desert for a while. He sees a village in the distance. Rey eventually catches up to him and asks who he is and what he's doing there. Finn fills her in on everything that happened, and Rey eventually decides to take him back to her village for safety. They mount her speeder and head back to the village. Meanwhile, back at Ankar Plutt's junkyard, we see a ship landing. The doors open and two figures walk out. We then see that they're Han Solo and Chewbacca. They see the Millennium Falcon in the distance and slowly approach it. While no one's looking, they break in and enter the Falcon. They enter the Falcon, look around, and Han says, "Chewie, we're home." They head for a control panel and start fiddling around with it. Meanwhile, Rey, Finn, and BB-8 return to the village. They discuss how they're going to keep Finn safe from the First Order. But before they get too deep in the details, they hear faint sounds of TIE fighters in the distance. They head back outside and see the TIE fighters approaching them. Rey, Finn, and BB-8 start running away from the pursuing TIE fighters. They get blasted out and fall to the ground. And once again, these same beats can play out as the original Force Awakens movie. Rey gets back up and offers Finn a hand. Finn takes it and they continue running. They try to run back to her speeder, but it gets blown up by a TIE fighter. They see the Millennium Falcon in the distance and run towards it. They see that the main doors open and enter it. But instead of heading straight for the cockpit, they bump into Han and Chewie. Han looks at them surprised and asks who they are. But before they say anything, they're blasted by more TIE fighters. Han and Chewie head for the cockpit, and after a couple attempts, they fly it out from away from the junkyard. And we can have a cool space battle, have the Falcon fly through down Star Destroyers, and eventually head away from the planet. As they fly away, Han turns to them and asks who they are and why those TIE fighters were pursuing them. They fill him in on everything that happened, and Han concludes that they should go to Maz Kanata's castle, the only place where Luke's lightsaber will be safe. Rey brings up there were stories about what happened, and Han turns to him and says, "They're true. All of it. The dark side, the Jedi, they're real." Han turns to Finn and asks where Luke is, but Finn informs him that Luke is dead. Han sighs in defeat and concludes that Luke would have wanted his lightsaber to be safe. He returns to the cockpit and sets the Millennium Falcon off to light speed. Meanwhile, back in the Star Destroyer, Kylo places the burnt Vader mask in his quarters. He hears the Emperor's voice congratulating him to find the relic, and the Emperor encourages him to find more. Kylo smiles coldly and says, "Nothing will stand in our way. I will finish what you started." Phasma enters and informs him that they captured a Resistance pilot. When this version is not going to be Poe Dameron, he's not going to be introduced until later. So the troopers drag in the pilot and throw him to the ground. Kylo then approaches him and demands him that he tell him where the resistance base is. The pilot refuses, and Kylo becomes angered. He uses the Force to torch the pilot, and eventually the pilot tells him the resistance base is on Takodana. Kylo smirks, ignites his lightsaber, and slays the pilot. He then turns to Phasma, orders her to take a fleet to Takodana and destroy it. Phasma nods and exits the quarters. Meanwhile, the heroes drop out of hyperspace and approach Takodana. They land outside Maz's castle and exit the Falcon. Han turns to Finn and Rey, hands him a couple blasters, and says, just in case. Finn and Rey take them and agree. Han leads the two of them into the castle and they enter. They look around and suddenly see Maz Kanata. She asks Han what he's doing there, and Han fills her in on everything. Finn hands her Luke's lightsaber and she takes it. She suddenly feels a strong presence in the Force and turns to Rey. She looks at her and says, "Who are you?" Rey looks down at her confused and says she's no one, but Maz looks up at her and says, "The Force, it's calling to you. Just let it in." Rey looks down at her with unbelief and tells her that she wants nothing to do with that. She turns around and sprints outside the castle. And these same beats can play out as the original Force Awakens, just with a few minor changes here and there. She exits the castle and looks up. She sees Kylo Ren's ship approaching, along with a fleet of TIE fighters. The ship lands and the doors open. Dozens of troopers pour out of the ship and start blasting at her. Rey retreats back into the forest and the troopers pursue her. They eventually catch up to her and surround her. With no other option, she closes her eyes and unintentionally taps into the Force. She slowly pulls out her blaster and starts blasting without even looking. She hits all her targets and they all fall to the ground. She opens her eyes and looks around in shock. She stows the blaster away and heads back to her friends. Meanwhile, the rest of the heroes exit the castle and are surrounded by troopers. The troopers order them to surrender, and they reluctantly place their hands behind their head. The heroes then pause and then look up in the distance. They see a fleet of X-Wings approaching them in the distance. The stormtroopers turn around and prepare for a battle. We then cut inside one of the cockpits and are introduced to our lead pilot, Poe Dameron. We have a cool dogfight, troopers on the ground get blasted away, and eventually the troopers retreat and head back to their ship. They fly off as a huge resistance ship lands next to the castle. The heroes gather around and wonder who's flying the ship. The doors open and General Leia and C-3PO exit. Han smiles at her and they have a brief reintroduction. Leia tells them to hop aboard her ship so they can fly off to the new resistance base. Rey, Finn, and BB-8 enter her ship and fly off, as Han and Chewbacca enter the Falcon and follow them. Meanwhile, back in the Star Destroyer, Phasma enters Kylo's quarters. Kylo turns to her and asks if she's found the lightsaber. Phasma sighs and informs him that they didn't, but they place a tracker on the Millennium Falcon and are using it to track down the resistance base. Kylo nods and commands her to send a fleet out to the resistance base and destroy it once and for all. Phasma obeys and exits the room. Kylo then reconnects with the Emperor. He asks the Emperor what he must do to become stronger. The Emperor instructs him to kill his father. It'll be the only way to make him stronger. Kylo hesitantly nods and exits his quarters. Meanwhile, the heroes arrive on the resistance base on Dakar. They land the ship, exit, and head into the base. Once inside, Maz hands Leia the lightsaber and fills her in on everything. Han then asks what they should do, and Leia tells him that Luke's their only hope. Finn tells her that Luke is dead, but Leia doesn't believe it. She closes her eyes and taps into the Force. She briefly connects with Luke, and she senses that he's on an ocean planet in the Outer Rim. Han tells her that he's been around that sector before, and concludes that the planet's called Ahch-To. Leia then orders Poe to lead a fleet to the planet and bring Luke back. Poe agrees and heads towards the exit, along with a couple other pilots. But suddenly alarms blare, and they all look around. An officer bursts into the room and Leia asks what's going on. The officer catches his breath and tells him that First Order ships are approaching. Leia then turns to Poe and tells him to prepare to defend the base. Poe nods and heads back to the hangar. Pilots enter the hangar and hop into their ships. They start their engines and fly away from the base. Poe looks up and sees a fleet of TIE fighters approaching them and engages in a dogfight. And this is where we begin to deviate significantly away from the original Force Awakens. In my version, there is no Starkiller base attack. I figure if you're gonna have a weapon that powerful, why not save it for episode 9? So this climax is gonna be smaller and more personal. So with all that being said, let's get back into the story. Meanwhile, back in the resistance base, Han turns to Leia and asks what they should do now. She tells him that they'll have to wait out the battle and look for their opportunity to escape and find Luke. Han wraps her arms around him and she closes her eyes to calm herself down. Han sighs and asks what they should do about their son, and Rey and Finn look at him in confusion. Leia informs them that Kylo Ren is their son, and Rey and Finn look at her speechless. Kylo Ren's ship eventually lands in front of the base and the doors open. He exits and approaches the base, igniting his lightsaber. He sees that the doors are closed and begins cutting his way through. Finn desperately asks what they should do next, and Han says he has an idea. Kylo finishes cutting open the door and enters the base. He stops and stares at the heroes. Han then steps forward and begs Kylo to lead the First Order and become part of their family again. He then stops as a tear rolls down his face. He says, "I know what I have to do, but I don't know if I have the strength to do it. Can you help me?" Han then says yes. Kylo takes out his lightsaber and stabs Han through the heart. The other heroes scream in anguish as Han's dead body collapses to the ground. Rey runs over to Han's dead body and crouches down. She looks up into Kylo Ren's face as tears roll down her eyes. Chewie pulls out his crossbow and begins blasting at Kylo. Kylo swings his lightsaber and starts deflecting all the blasts. Finn becomes angered and snatches Luke's lightsaber out from Leia's hands. He ignites Luke's lightsaber and taps into the Force. He charges towards Kylo Ren. They briefly duel each other. Finn swipes the lightsaber at Kylo and slashes him across the face. Kylo becomes angered and taps into his hate. He gets the upper hand on Finn and slices him across the back. Finn collapses to the ground and drops the lightsaber. Kylo then uses the Force to pull the lightsaber back to him, but it doesn't work. Rey closes her eyes and taps into the Force. She raises her hand and pulls the lightsaber towards her. The lightsaber leaps into her hand and she looks down at it with unbelief. Kylo then becomes even more angered, demands that she give him the lightsaber, and slowly approaches her. Rey lifts her hands to defend herself, but suddenly force lightning is projected from them. It hits Kylo Ren and he's projected back several feet. Everyone stares at her in shock, no pun intended. And this is where I'm deviating a little bit more. I think if Lucasfilm wanted to have the reveal that Rey's a Palpatine, they need to start setting up seeds early on. And if you want to have more of a parallel with A New Hope, you can't have Rey being good at everything as the story goes on. You have to start planting little seeds early on, and have her slowly but surely build into the character she is. So I think her displaying a big show of the Force by projecting lightning is a good way to emphasize that. So with all that being said, let's finish up the story. Kylo Ren is speechless. He turns back and retreats into his ship. He then orders the troopers to retreat, and they fly away. Poe and the other pilots cheer and head back to the base. Later that day, Han's body is laid out on a funeral pyre, and they all mourn him. Finn is taken to a medical facility and laid down on a bactopod. Rey enters the room and sees him. She says thank you and goodbye, kisses him on the cheek, and exits. She then enters the ship hangar, sees Chewbacca and the Millennium Falcon. Leia approaches and instructs her to go to Ahch-To to find Luke and bring him back into the fight. She also tells her that Luke will help train her to control her abilities. Rey nods and tells her that she'll try her best. She and Chewbacca turn to the Falcon and enter it. They sit in the cockpit, start up the engines, fly up to light speed towards Ahch-To, hoping that Luke will join the fight. And that's how we end Episode 7. So those are my thoughts of what Disney and Lucasfilm should have done with Episode 7 to start planting the seeds for the sequel trilogy. But these are just my opinions. Let me know what you guys think by sharing your thoughts in the comments below. And let me know if you'd like me to share my thoughts on how Episode 8 and 9 could have been. But in the meantime, give this video a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. And may the Force be with you, always.